We are on the heels of the Memorial Day weekend, and this is the third interview in the Caesar's Messiah 2023 series on Magic Jesus. Let me welcome our special guest, author Joseph Atwill.
Hi, Philip. Good to be here.
I trust you had an enjoyable weekend.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Good. I'm going to jump right into it. I've wondered for a long time why you don't address the Josephine apologia for the Jews, known as Contra Appian.
Well, actually, I have written quite a bit about it. I just haven't published it.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I perhaps, if you wanted to discuss it, I could try to get up all of that information. No, there's a whole puzzle inside it. This goes to the category that I had mentioned in one of our other conversations. The Caesar's Messiah analysis is sort of the low-hanging fruit of what exists in the relationship between Josephus and the Gospels. And so I published just the core kind of military linkage typology. I was just trying to put enough of it, in the book to give to the public so they could understand the identity of the Son of Man that Jesus predicts. So that's really the purpose of Caesar's Messiah, is just to show the typologic relationship and the fact that sequence is something that New Testament scholarship had just completely overlooked. And that when you apply, the concept of sequential typology, to analyzing the Gospels in relationship to Josephus, then it's just clear as a bell. And the evidence is basically straightforward and simple enough. I thought that it would be the best introduction. But beyond that, there's just all kinds of puzzles, and Contra Appian is one of them. It's just I didn't want to get into too much of that because I knew that I would have enough to defend just with the military war typology. And if I got into some of the other puzzles that they were creating, that they're so abstract that they would be, what I was afraid of is that the criticism would just focus on the how far-fetched these relationships were. And it is a kind of building block, as I'm sure you're aware, Philip, is that you need to go through the very beginning of the typology to get to an understanding of the more complicated stuff. Because a lot of it is actually literally building blocks where they use elements from prior typologic connections in a new puzzle structure. And so I just thought that was too difficult for the reader to go through, and I would just spend all of my time just kind of in analysis with scholars in terms of the most far-fetched puzzles, because that would be how they would typically criticize particularly something as novel as the Caesar's Messiah theory. So I have a whole other book which it's interesting in that it's actually centered on a Shakespearean play, Timon of Athens, which is sort of the conclusion of the Shakespearean, response to the Flavian humor. And it has a whole, kind of discussion between Trajan and Domitian, which is linked into Suetonius, the letters to Pliny the Younger's letters to Trajan. And so, I mean, you can see that it's just, it just gets very, very complicated. Anyway, sorry to be so long-winded, but so that's why I didn't bring out my thoughts on Contra Appian. And I have written them up, and there is this whole other book, which I will one day bring out. And it's one of the problems is that my work gets so entwined with later authors, who are involved in kind of a cryptic response to the Gospels, and so it actually does end up inside of modern political problems and relationships. And so as the world goes forward, I try to, like the book is basically almost something that could never be finished because there's new things that can be added onto it. But anyway, at some point I'll bring it out. The Probably the next book that I would bring out is my analysis of like modern authors, and I would put out some of this in that. I have a lot of analysis of Huxley and even more modern like Ken Kesey and things like that. So anyway, that's it's in the future, and I'm grateful that there are a few kind of alert and imaginative scholars that are even interested in this stuff. And I'll definitely see if I can get some of the analysis to you so that you can give me your comments on it.
Right. There are legends about Shakespeare that he was peculiarly dialed in on an understanding of ancient mystery cults and this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book called Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and I show that the plays are basically a specific response to the Flavian humor in the Gospels, and they're kind of uh, a, a kind of a reversing of the mockery that the Flavians made of the Jewish Messianic rebels. And so the group that produces Shakespeare is aware of this. They know the structure of the comedy, and so they decide that they would do the same thing to the Roman literature that the Roman literature did to the Jewish kind of religious literature, and they created this very really black comic response to it. So when people say, well, Shakespeare seems to be aware of this, yeah, he was totally aware of it. I mean, it's the whole basis for his literature was, this cryptic, kind of understanding that is inside our culture, but never quite comes forward and articulates itself. I think high-level Freemasons are all aware of it, but it's part of their oath-taking structure, I suspect, that they don't, mention this to the public, that they know the real origins of the Christian literature.
Right. In fact, one of the features I've noticed is the character in A Midsummer Night's Dream that ends up believing he's transformed into a donkey, and then the old legends about the Jews worshiping the donkey.
Yeah, it's a completely clear description of the donkey humor in Shakespeare in that play. That's um, that play was actually decoded pretty well. I didn't spend a lot of time working on it. I read when I was doing my initial Shakespearean analysis. I read the plays in general, but didn't spend much time with it. I could see what they were. I mean, it was just self-evident what this all was. But I showed my analysis to a guy that I had worked with in the Gospels, a guy named John Hudson, and he then worked specifically on that play and did a theatrical production of it, I believe, in New York, where he, showed the Flavian level of humor within it. In Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, I focus on Titus Andronicus because it's really the beginning of the Shakespearean typology. It's the easiest to understand. And in that play, you have, well, Titus, so they aren't really going too far afield, metaphorically here. The character Titus, and he brings about a Last Supper where people are unwittingly eating human flesh. So it's an obvious reversal of the situation in the Gospels. And moreover, he even has in Titus Andronicus, you have a crucifixion scene where the stand-in for Josephus begs, the Roman commander to take the Messianic child down from the cross, and the child survives. So you have just a very transparent connection into sort of the Flavian typology, and they have a lot of the same names, so it helps people. It was with all these kinds of cryptic literary pieces. The author doesn't really want the public to be aware of them immediately, but definitely does want them to be understood. I mean, otherwise, why write the stuff? It's like, why would the Flavians create the typology in the Gospels? It's very, very hard to write, takes a lot of work, but they did it because of legacy. So, these plays are actually meant to be decoded. It's just that people didn't have the framework with which to understand them.
May I make an observation,
Of
please?
course.
Okay. Andronicus is a parallel name to Alexander. And we find with the Flavians even that they are still somewhat in the mythic shadow of Alexander the Great.
Sure. I mean, these things are all in the thought world, and when you start, applying your understanding of history to the literature, you're definitely going to have a deeper understanding of it. Andronicus, Titus Andronicus, the name was chosen because of Andronica in 2 Maccabees. He was the one who stole things out of the temple, and so they're just using they don't call the character Titus Flavius, but Titus Andronicus, because Andronicus is a parallel to Titus Flavius in that he's one of the handful of people, I think maybe 3 or 4 people, who ever actually broke into the Jewish temple and stole things out of it. So that was why the authors chose the name Andronicus. But there is a lot of Alexander the Great humor in Shakespeare. I mean, in one passage they talk about Alexander the pig, not Alexander the Great. They're denigrating Alexander the Great because, remember, he's someone who conquered the Jews. So it's like, from the group that produces Shakespeare are converso. They were Jews who were forced to ostensibly be baptized and be Christians. That was the only way you could be legally inside of Britain at that time. But they had retained their understanding of religion and history, and so that was why when they look at history, they just saw a different world than a lot of the perspectives that was given with inside of Christian history. So yeah, I mean, I would say you would I mean, we can talk at some other time about there's a lot of different Alexander the Great connections within Shakespeare that people haven't recognized, but you can see once you start understanding what they're doing with the literature.
Okay, and I'm glad that you mentioned Moses in one of our previous discussions as possibly coming to the Jews, I think, from the Hasmoneans or Carthaginians. Is that not the case?
Yeah. I mean, that's the theory I have. My thought is that there is a strange, I mean, there is a relationship between the Hasmoneans and the Israelites in that they're both Semitic. And Josephus actually has some cryptic passages talking about sort of a hidden understanding between the 2 groups. The Carthaginians, were defeated by the Romans, and their culture literally evaporated by the Romans. You had Hannibal, with the elephants waging war inside of Italy for years and years. I mean, it was just this enormous and impossible to defeat for a period of time army right inside Italy itself. It eventually got driven out and headed east, and then it sort of, the conclusion of it is not recorded specifically. And so my take is that it was only a few years later that you have the Hasmoneans come into into existence, and then begun their assault on the Hellenized Judea zone. And so my thought is that, well, it just seems logical that the Moses stories could have been shared by both groups in some way, and therefore, when Judas Maccabee was setting up his his army and his religious culture, that he may have simply been a descendant of or a member of, because I think he could have actually lived that long, but in any case, certainly a descendant of someone within Hannibal's army, and that was really the origin of then the Orthodox application of Judaism into the Hellenized world. And it kind of works in terms of historical logic, because the Carthaginians would have been, obviously in no mood to have accepted any, kind of Hellenized culture into their world, having just fought this generations, of warfare with the Roman Empire. They would have been, I would imagine, they would have been opposed to all of it. So this is sort of, you can understand where the fundamentalism comes from. There's just nothing really known about the Jewish religion. I mean, you have some documents which, who knows exactly what the provenance is. But before the Hasmoneans, what really were the Jews? You have the David stories and the Moses stories, which are not particularly linked in any way, and not much else. And there's very little archaeologic evidence, just precious bits, and even that, it's kind of, you have to retrofit the literature on top of the scant archaeologic evidence to make any kind of, coherent history of the whole thing. So it's not very strong. And the idea of the Carthaginians bringing this literature into Judea, driving out the Hellenized, cultural elements, and then setting up a fundamental religion, it kind of makes sense. Now, if asked to prove this, I would say I can't. I don't have enough data points. I can only show logic and then conjecture from there. But I mean, it's as good an explanation as is given, and I think it would be a good platform for research, for heaven's sakes. I mean, this would make perfect sense to me, to start trying to link the Carthaginians and the Hasmoneans to see, what you can come up with.
Okay, Russell B. Gmerkin had written a book where he's using a supposed historian from Egypt called Manetho in regard to Exodus. And I've noticed that scholars are kind of signing on to this. But weren't there really a number of Manethos that are we're really getting secondhand or third hand, and we don't really know who Manetho is? That seems to me to be how it washes out.
Right. I don't know specifically that storyline. I've never read Russell's work, but I would say just in general, there is so much effort applied by modern historians to maintain the historicity of the characters that have been given, the authorship of the literature we have, that it is it's very detrimental to clear-minded thinking. I mean, for example, look at the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I mean, even though it's perfectly likely that you had committees producing this literature, but for some reason the idea that these are, these unique individuals and that they had control over the literature, even though, of course, you have, verbatim passages in all three works, which couldn't possibly have emanated from more than one author. But still, and in fact, I'll just digress and point out that the whole synoptic problem is directly related to this phenomena, where rather than just accepting the literature and as we have it, and not pretending to believe we really understand who the authors were, the author is a name that has been given, possibly the author of the literature, but we can't just try to has that as a fixed idea and then defend it without some more evidence. What I would say, about like Gmerkin's idea is that there's the old adage that the Iliad wasn't written by Homer, but by someone who looked like him and had the same name. I mean, it's exactly that problem, is that we just don't have enough points of data to back up the assertion of this individual, that is producing the literature. In fact, I would even go so far to say that Josephus is also a nom de plume, and I'm sure a number of authors were involved in the project. I'm virtually positive. And certainly, for example, his Greek skills get better when the second book, Antiquities, is put out. And people have noticed this, and they've done some word analysis, and the explanation is, as well, he must have trained himself and improved his Greek, because the Greek in antiquity is a little bit better, a little more elevated. And that is far-fetched, because in your adult life, when you're like over 50, as Josephus was when he was writing this stuff, you just don't make improvements in your language skills. Very, very rare. And so, I just think it's a far more natural explanation just to say, we have the literature, we have the name of someone who is claiming to be the author, but that's as far as we can take it. We should just keep an open mind. And I think that this gives it's just a better way to analyze the literature. You don't get,
Okay.
because the fact is they use the idea of an author, a single author, as sometimes in their propaganda, like Josephus, when he's supposed to be this Jewish priest and have all these Jewish connections, and then he comes to the understanding in a divinely inspired moment that the old covenant has been broken and the new covenant has come into existence, and it's with Rome. Well,
Right.
I mean, to me, that's like, okay. I mean, if you're buying into the historical Josephus, it's very far-fetched. But if you just look at him as as the historical character that is being created by this literature, as having potentially propaganda purposes, and could well just be a nom de plume of who knows what organization, then I just think you're more clear-minded, and you come up with clearer analysis.
It seems to me that the Jesus myth is the best thing that could have happened to Jerusalem, mythologically speaking, in that it now elevates them above the centers like Tyre, that were the centers of Phoenician, Canaanite sort of society previously. So if you get this great hero and he's killed right there in Jerusalem, and you're relating this to the destiny of this city, I see it as linking the Romans and the Jews in a very profound, powerful mythological way.
Well, that's certainly what happened, isn't it?
Yes.
As to what the purpose for the literature, I think the overt reasons would be one that it would be a tamer version of Messianic Judaism that could more easily fit into the Roman Empire than the stuff you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then beyond that, there's just the vanity of the Caesars. That was the real purpose, oddly enough, of the Gospels. It was just to create this vast typologic connections that end up with making it easy to identify the Son of Man that Jesus is predicting, and thereby indicating that the Roman Caesars were in fact the God of the Jews. This was just their little vanity moment, and that's why they went to all that trouble to produce it. I mean, I know it's kind of anticlimactic after all of the power that the Gospels has had with our culture to come to that understanding, but that's just my analysis.
Okay, now I've noticed that the Bible says that the king of Tyre is in Eden. Now, Tyre is that symbol of the Tyrian purple that defined the Phoenician people in the Greek mind, Greeks calling them red men or Phoenicians.
Yeah, I mean, and of course the Phoenicians end up in Carthage, and these connections all swing back around. I think, and I wonder, do you think that there was kind of a royalty, because it's so often the case that the purple and is a kind of association of royalty, and perhaps that was just how the Carthaginians, who at one point would have been the power of the Mediterranean, would have perhaps been seen, and by the Judeans.
Yes, definitely. Also, the mythic hero always puts on the red coat or the purple coat. And once he does this, he is a goner. Okay, he's going to go down. And it
Yeah.
happens to Heracles. I could name off a short list of very famous mythic heroes, including Red Riding Hood, that this happens to.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'd never considered that, but that's true. That
Heracles is killed by the red coat. It's got the blood,
Yeah.
it's got the hydra venom on it. And the centaur has tricked the wife of Heracles into giving him this coat if he is ever untrue to her, and that this will bring him back, but it doesn't. It causes him to get killed.
Yeah. Well, uneasy is the head that wears the crown, and you don't want to wear the coat of divinity unless you've got good bodyguard system, because you end up being a target.
That's what you got. And so this king of Tyre in Eden, Robert M. Price identifies as Adam, or the Adam, whichever he is. Now, he is made from the red soil to begin with. And I think it's a pun on Terra, that it's
Yeah.
marking him as the king of the earth, which is the ancient title of El, the god El.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the analysis makes absolutely perfect sense to me. I'd have to like actually spend a bunch of time with it to come to a better, deeper understanding, but it certainly is logical. It's just that these connections are, they're just not the subject of not just New Testament scholarship, but just historical research in general, because they involve imagination and just to see the connections and logic. And it's strange, isn't it? I mean, the whole historical approach to the Christian era and the pre-Christian era is just I guess the excuse for its impotence is that it suffered from the infusion of faith for thousands of years, and this made hard-headed analysis more, well, impossible, basically. And so therefore you ended up with just, it was ingrained that the Gospels were in fact a kind of history, and this then made other kinds of analysis more difficult, right? You couldn't go into this kind of stuff because it had, obviously it could lead to an unraveling of the foundation of the history that leads up to Christ. So this could be a very interesting era in terms of historical both analysis and speculation. And I think speculation has also been dramatically reduced in ancient history because of Christianity and the faith, and it's really needed, because it's through speculation that you get new theories. So we're looking for the strongest interpretive framework of all of the historical data we have, and I just think like particularly with Caesar's Messiah, you start seeing what you can do once you're away from the idea of we're dealing with the histories of the gospel, when the power of the Christian memory that is inside Europeans is abates to the extent that you start being able to just imagine whole other ideas about, well, how did the gospels, and how did the whole history that led up to it, what, because let's face it, I mean, I would say that most of what we call of history and is used as historical data points could well just be oligarchic fictional literature for political purposes.
Right, propaganda.
Yeah.
Might we not compare the New Testament to a Trojan horse hiding the Roman enemy within what appears as a divine tribute or gift to the Jews?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And all the educated people in the ancient world speak Greek, and they know about Troy. And that Troy was the big center for mythology for centuries.
Sure, exactly right. So,
Okay.
this, you've laid out just a really good area for research, and I am hoping, and of course, I think everyone should hope that we kind of move into an area or an era that looks at the what has been given to us as history as in fact propaganda. I think it's important to understand what's been given as ancient history in this way, and it's certainly important to look at what media gives us as history in our current era, isn't it? So the idea of developing a more sensitive and alert consciousness toward the possibility of history as being false and in fact propaganda for social control. I think that's like the most important transition that humankind can make. I mean, it's actually, in my mind, it's very similar to the Enlightenment. You know how necessary that period was in order to move beyond the feudal system. I think now, the idea of understanding propaganda, and history and media claims as propaganda, and that this will lead to the skepticism and energy to sort of break through the facade so that the public can understand that CNN, Fox, CBS, the oligarchic platforms are just structured as propaganda from the very beginning. You can't believe anything that they say, frankly. You need to have a different way of understanding. And this is really why, because we're having this discussion, we're basically participating in the new media, the independent media. And you can see why it's made such incredible inroads. I mean, it's just evaporating the legacy media, which is trying to control, the independent aspect of it. I mean, I saw a Rasmussen poll saying that a third of Americans didn't take the vaccine. And this is a complete victory of the independent media. I mean, if they had rolled that thing out in 1950, subscription would have been 99.9%. I mean, everyone would have taken it. There'd been no skepticism whatsoever regarding it. And I'm not, trying to transition into a discussion of like the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, but I just want to point out that this just shows the dramatic change that's occurred and the level of skepticism and agency of the citizen in relationship to the media, that the citizen is now saying, I don't know if I just believe these things because they tell it to me. I think I need to do some research to verify. And that's when I spoke of this revolution that we are experiencing, that's a perfect example of it.
Right. Okay. In Caesar's Messiah, was the Jesus character actually sacrificed or not? And if not, was Simon Magus sacrificed in his place?
Yeah, I've seen these ideas. In the Gospels, the character Jesus, is a fictional character. It's a typologic character, and he must be sacrificed because he represents the Passover lamb of the new covenant. And they're creating a mirror, a typologic mirror of the old covenant. Now, to do that, the first thing they did was back calculate 40 years from the fall of Masada. I mean, this was the end of actually, no, the point that they really originated everything from would have been the fall of the temple. And then from that, they went 3.5 years into the future and claimed that was when Masada fell, because they were trying to create a Daniel week of 7 years, right? So
Right.
you have the abomination of desolation, which is just overtly stated by Josephus as occurring at a particular point in time. And in fact, Whiston, the famous translator of Josephus, has a footnote saying, gosh, it's amazing. This is a miracle. Jesus was absolutely right. He saw the abomination of desolation is about to happen. And this was 3.5 years, more or less, from when the Flavians entered the battle. And then, of course, it's 3.5 years from that point, more or less, to when you have the fall of Masada. So you have the construction of Daniel's week. Now, that had to be aligned to the destruction of the temple, to the abomination of desolation that Daniel says occurs in the midpoint of a week. So this was how you get the chronology of the first century, is you get that the point of the abomination of desolation occurring, and from that, which is just before the temple falls, you get the construction of the week. But in addition to the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, you also get this creation of a new mirror, a typologic mirror to the first covenant, because you're creating a new covenant. So you have the old covenant, you have to get rid of that, but you're using the same elements to show that you are emerging from the hand of God is creating divine relationships, and this is how you know that this is the new divine religion on earth, is this new covenant. And therefore you have the crucifixion occurring at 33 CE, and then 40 years to the day going forward in time, you have the conclusion of the mirror, because in the first covenant you have the Passover, and then 40 years later you have the introduction of the Israelites into the Promised Land, right? So the 40-year cycle exists between the Passover lamb and the Promised Land. Well, and to create the new covenant, you have the human Passover lamb, and Jesus is specifically set up as a human Passover lamb, and with the symbols, that they give in the Gospels. And then 40 years later, precisely, you have the fall of Masada, at which point the Romans now control the Promised Land. So you can see that all of these numbers were back calculated from, and they're artificial. They can't possibly be circumstantial, but they can't possibly be real either. So it's just a symbolic creation of a new covenant. Now, in that structure, the character Jesus does need to die. He apparently comes back to life, though there's different ways to read that story. And I give some of those in Caesar's Messiah, but nevertheless, his death is real as anything in a fictional story. So,
okay, but what about Simon Magus?
The problem is that I have is that I've seen different kinds of analysis of it, and they're all very logical, frankly. But you have this post literature phenomenon, which is that once you've got the Jesus story out there, people will do what can be called riffs upon it. You know what I'm saying? That they can take it and draw connections into characters that they want, and so you don't really know how the origin, the provenance of that literature is. And as an example, compare like the Simon Magus stuff to the Nag Hammadi material. Nag Hammadi material is clearly derived from the Gospels, but it's also clearly different. Someone has actually, gone to all the trouble of creating the Gospel characters and, using some of the Gospel story, but then weaving in their own political and theological, biases, to make their stories. And so with Simon, I think what happens is that, well, first of all, the character in the Gospel, Simon, is a typologic construction based upon the Simon who is the military leader of the rebellious Messianic movement. So Simon and John were the leaders, and you have all of this typologic relationship between the Simon Messianic leader, who's a rebel, and the Simon who is a disciple of the character of Jesus Christ in the Gospels. So you have that as a platform. Now, from there, since Simon is such a powerful figure in both historical structures, both in the Messianic Jewish world and in the Roman Christian world, I think you're obviously going to, you have a great, kind of what I call it, milieu that can be entered into by authors coming, later. I don't think that the characters post 70 that are identified as Simon or written about post 70 can really be seen as historical, or in fact, it's all just an extension of the kind of religious fantasy literature that is not only in place in the Gospels, but is also in place in Josephus. You see what I mean? Because Josephus's history are also, in fact, there may be real events woven in there, I'm sure of that, but there are also events which are fictional that the Roman authors of Josephus are just inserting to denigrate the Messianic rebels, or have some political purpose. And so the character Simon who is kind of, the way that he's presented in Josephus is, I think, not historical. I think it's, he's being presented in a particular way for a religious purpose, which is to say Roman Christianity. And then the same thing is true of the character then in the Gospels. And so now beyond that, when you get into the Simon Magus stuff, you have a platform not of history but of religious fantasy, and that's the genre I think is in play with the future kind of descriptions of Simon, I think that therefore they're it's hard to plug them into any kind of history, but you can make perfect sense out of them in terms of literary symbolism.
Okay, now is not Jesus represented as a thaumaturge or theurgist like Apollonius of Tyana, who develops magical powers showing his spiritual attainment?
Sure. I mean, I would say the Apollonian guy is really based on Jesus rather than the other way around. I think that literature, it's mysterious, but it definitely comes from the imperial court. I mean, in the Gospels, you have to link it into Josephus properly to understand that the Gospels are imperial court literature. But with the stuff about Apollonius, I mean, that was just it's recorded as having been paid for by I think the emperor's wife, or something, and so it's 100% imperial court literature. And when you then link it back to Jesus, all the parallels, all of the different, kind of relationships that these two literatures have, you can see that they are both expressing the bias of the imperial court. Now, I'll give you my take on Apollonius is that, you had the struggle which ended, Council in Nicaea, Constantine, when they made the overt decision to just go with Christianity. They were going to, put the Roman military in back of it and get rid of the other religions and have just one religion, one monotheistic religion, which then became the basis for the slave system of the feudal era, right? I mean, so that was what I think Constantine was doing. He was setting up the feudal system. Took a long time to get there, but he was definitely structuring that system, and Christianity was going to be the religious platform for it. So there was a struggle, though. I think there was another, branch of Roman political power that wanted to maintain the historical Roman religions. And so I think that Apollonius was basically the replacement that group had for Jesus. But notice with his name, you're not into a Hebraic monotheistic character,
Right.
but rather, someone who can, get along with the whole, pantheon of all of the different, the Romans had gods for every day of the year, right? So they had
Right.
all.
Well, it would be like Saul Paulus, isn't he kind of a
Exactly.
bridge?
Exactly. And so that's the thing is that I think that they were trying, there was contestation. They weren't sure which approach they were going to go with. But when they finally made the decision, when Constantine made the decision to go with Roman Christianity, then everything else had to get swept away. But you can see with Apollonius, what I think is most interesting to research is just the relationship to the structure of literature, because this guy is so close to the character of Jesus. The main difference is just that he is a pagan. so you could have the imperial cult, you could have all of the Roman house deities, and everything could just go on as it was. And Apollonius would sop up eventually all the people who wanted some kind of, sort of the warm fuzzy religion, that some people would see Christianity as presenting, and so that this would, and there was Roman imperial backing for the cult, and but it all, I mean, I have no idea how all of this, because when you go from the pagan into the Christian era, you don't have, there's not much historical documentation of this, so you're just going to conjecture. But for one reason or another, Constantine, got rid of well, first of all, those that were trying to share power with him. He became the sole Caesar, and after the brutal, civil war, and then he started the process of creating the monotheistic, basis for the feudal system. Though, of course, this didn't affect his personal life much. I mean, he was still representing himself as Apollo. If you look at, there's some really good analysis of the Arch of Constantine, which shows that it was structured to actually represent Constantine as Apollo. They had
Yeah.
a statue of Apollo, which kind of becomes Constantine, if you walk toward the arch. And so he was a pagan, and but he had a political purpose for Christianity, and he inserts it into Roman life as mandated. But Apolloninus was, I mean, that would have, just imagine if Constantine decided to go with Apolloninus as the feudal system, state religion, we'd have a whole different world at this point.
Right. Okay. Well, now speaking of the donkey again, the lead character in Apuleius's Golden Ass learns magic. He's getting this mystery cult spiritual attainment stuff. So he tries to turn himself into a bird, but he turns himself into a donkey. And then this thing just rolls on and on very satirically about how this donkey gets abused by everybody. And it's the people in the mystery cults doing it to him. And so finally, at the end of the thing, the very, very long story, he becomes an attorney, and he's had his fling with the mystery cults, and he takes a dim view of them.
Yeah,
You
I,
know?
I think there's a lot there, and gee, this would be it would be a conversation that we'd have to have a lot of preamble to, because there is so much metaphorical connection. But in Shakespeare's Caesar's Messiah, I have a chapter basically dedicated to the whole donkey ass's head tradition inside of Christianity. And Philip, this is a vast and far-reaching metaphor. It's typical of their style, and it's typical of the stuff I don't really want to discuss with people who haven't read the beginning, of the building blocks of typology, that I lay out in Caesar's Messiah. But in Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, I have this whole connection to the ass's head, and really what this is about, what it's representing, is you have Golgotha, and where the empty skull, that Jesus was crucified, supposedly this location, which is just metaphorical. It's not a real place. And then in Josephus, you have the crucifixion story, which is the parallel to the story in the Gospels. And I won't go into all that. People
Okay.
can look at that, and that particular parallel is so well known at this point. I'm never given a citation for it, but it's virtually like a genre on the internet. People are always studying, how the gospel story of the crucifixion is obviously based upon the Josephus story. Anyway, so Josephus' story takes place at Thekoa, which is, as I see it, a pun on Theokoos, which is the god of reason that the Romans had. And so what they're really representing is they are infusing reason into the messianic religious leader, and so they prune the head. However, you have this issue about, well, what happens to the head, and this is actually covered in this vast typology, which I go into a little bit into Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, where there's a story about how an ass head will be inserted on someone, Elijah, And so they use this whole typologic connection from the story in the Old Testament, and they put it into Josephus, which is a really good, I put it in, it's in Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and it's a really good kind of way to understand Josephus, because he's presenting this event as a straightforward historical event. But if you look at the relationships to the story in the Old Testament, you can see that, well, no, it's impossible. This is actually, they're representing a recreation, a recapitulation of the story in in the Old Testament, which ends up with this idea about an ass head, being put on someone. And so, and again, this is one of these complicated things, but but this is, it ends up with just suggestions that you've got an ass head that is basically, after the individual is pruned. Okay, now here is, you have in Josephus, you have the character captured on the Mount of Olives, and he's from
Okay, is Saint Paul being feminized there by his pruning?
Well, Paul's, when he talks about grafting, I think Paul is representing. It's this too much of a digression to go into, but Paul is actually kind of, he is branching off of, to use an expression, of the vegetative humor that is inside the Gospels and Josephus. Okay, Paul, then he talks about we're going to graft on, and he is being feminized in the sense that there is a whole genre about his castration, right? And let me just back up and explain it. It's in Acts, you have the story of a group who knows Paul. They includes a member of the family of Herod. So this gives you an idea about their feeling about Jewish religious leaders, right?
Right.
And so they capture him, and they lay hands on him. The language is very clear. We lay hands on him, and then they sever him for the Lord. Sever him for the
Right.
Lord.
And he's called Saul in Josephus.
He's called, and also in Acts, at this point, he is Saul.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Right. So he's called Saul, but the next line, or actually a few lines later in Acts, you have the statement, Saul, now called Paul. Now, what was the reason for the transition of the name? Well, Paul means tiny. And in the passage above, Saul is severed. And so you see, it's actually a penis joke.
Right. Erectile dysfunction was considered high humor in the ancient world, I think.
Exactly. And so here they're goofing off of the circumcision, tradition in Judaism,
Right.
but it's taking it to a Roman comic extreme where Paul is severed and therefore he becomes basically castrated, which is why he is now tiny. Paul is now tiny. Saul, now called Paul.
Okay.
So this is the the feminization is one way of describing it. I mean, basically demasculization, and this is just Roman imperial cult humor. This is the kind of humor that they had concerning the Messianic Jews that rebelled. No doubt, it's inside their literature, and it then kind of pops up at various points in the in what they present as this religious history of the pseudo Jewish messianic movement of Christianity. So.
Okay, let me just read a couple things from the Bible very quickly regarding Paul. And I'd like to make the point that he is called a herald in parts of the Bible. It says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and humanity, Christ Jesus, himself human, who gave himself a ransom for all, a testimony at the proper time. For this I was appointed a herald and an apostle. I am telling the truth, I am not lying, and a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. And that's from, I think, Colossians or Timothy. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. Then in Philippians, it says, and I trust in the Lord that I myself will come soon. But I thought it necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger and minister to my needs. Now, the herald is both a military rank and a sacred office. And Paul gets compared to Hermes, in fact, even called Hermes in Acts, who is the herald god of the Greek tradition.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I can't really comment on that other than to say it's completely coherent. And you know,
Well, see, because I tried this with Price and they kind of talked over me, and
you
Price
know, but the
Price
thing is,
doesn't want to see him as a herald. Okay,
well,
but I
well,
know he's a herald.
yeah,
All right.
I don't know if Robert really does want to see him in that. I think what you've done is you've just taken them out of the area where they can be kind of feel comfortable because they just haven't done the analysis, so they're not familiar with these concepts. You know, I mean, there's when you get into imagination and logical conjecture, right? Like this idea about the herald. It's really tough because you're just outside of classic New Testament scholarship's historical playbook. You know, they have this very tiny playbook if you think about it. You know, I mean, you've got the literature, and then you have some analysis that is agreed upon. You know, like Markian priority, something like this. You know, and these are the elements of what they think is Christian scholarship. And someone who looks at this literature and go, you know, this is really not making a lot of sense, and we should need to apply a different into speculation. You know, I mentioned early that one of the things that New Testament scholarship has suffered from, and in my opinion, because of the weight of Christian, of the power of Christian history, right, of it being history, of the story of Jesus as real, as reflecting some historical events, that there just hasn't been the kind of you know, vision of the literature as having metaphorical origin and meaning. It's really that simple. And even and I don't mean to denigrate Price, who's
No, nor I, sir.
he's probably the best classical scholar that we have.
I
mean,
agree.
that would be my take on Robert.
I agree.
But even someone like that, you can quickly get outside of, you know, his thought world because he can't study everything. Really, it's best if possible to put the stuff in text and try to get, you know, sort of exchanges between scholars on it, but that's so difficult to do. That's so very difficult to do.
Okay,
I mean,
why does Paul teach from the hall of the Tyrannus in Ephesus?
got me. I
Okay,
mean,
because I think that's a great mystery.
yeah,
The tyrant can be seen as any king, even if he came to the throne legitimately. If he becomes tyrannical, he would have, even in the classical period, been referred to as a tyrannus. And so
yeah,
we have Oedipus Tyrannus as a very famous example of how he comes to power and it goes to his head. And the next thing you know, he wants to find the guilty man of killing the king, and he is the guilty man of killing the king. So he brings in the Greek Saint Paul, who is Tiresias. No, not Tarsus, but Tiresias. And Tiresias speaks truth to power. And this does not go well. Okay, you know, and Oedipus ends up gouging out his own eyes in final recognition that he is the guilty man, you know.
well,
So
yeah,
this
I mean,
is deep
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, it's very deep stuff. And you know, the thing is they are, even though I haven't spent any time at all studying that stream of analysis, this is kind of the where I think you're going to find a lot of the Christian fantasy stories originate from, is they are connected into Greek mythology because that was such a, you know, strong component of the Roman thought world that they would use it. And let me explain why they would do that. Because the group to which they were addressing their really deep and sometimes comic connections, like say just take your analysis as correct, right? Well, who are they writing that for? Well, they're writing it for their you know, the circle that they exist with intellectually. And that circle, we at least can know that they would have had really deep understanding of the Greek literature and mythologies, right? So that's really where we should be looking. In other words, your instinct is completely correct that this is kind of how we should start to deconstruct a lot of these Christian fantasy stories. They don't come from people who are Jewish individuals who have converted, or from people who are zealots for Christianity. They originate from Roman intellectuals who thought world would have been Greek mythology.
Right.
So
That's what I like most about the Bible, is its relation to the Greek myth.
yeah. Well, I mean that is if you try to find its historical connection, rather than looking, into the first century wandering around of a radical rabbi, look in Greek mythology, because this is really the basis. The historical basis is the historical mythological literature and stories that all of the Roman imperial court intellectuals would have known about, and also would have used as metaphorical structures with the knowledge that they could be understood. You see what I'm saying? You wouldn't write this stuff if you didn't think someone could ever understand it, and or find, or praise you for having been so clever. So that's why the first place you want to look is in their thought world. And that is, of course, the Greek mythologic, stories and the Greek literature.
Okay, now I've heard you identify the name Mary as signifying rebellion, and I don't disagree with that. But have you ever identified Mary with water, or bitter water, or the sea, or Miriam's well?
Yeah, remember the whole Mary, and if you look at Luke, when you've got, Mary Magdalene, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then of course the conclusion where these characters come together, at the crucifixion. That's all related to the fishing in the Sea of Galilee. So yeah, there's definitely connections there. You have this Mary Magdalene, which the town can possibly mean. It's one of there's different interpretations of it, but it can mean fish tower, right? High tower, which was the sea. The towns along the Sea of Galilee would have had fishing as the primary industry, and so as Jesus wanders through this area, which of course is representing eventually Titus doing the same thing, you're dealing with sea, right? It's the Sea of
Right.
Galilee fishing.
Well, and Lady Asherah of the Sea was also this mother of all living character
Yeah.
that gets applied to Mary.
Yeah, I just point out the obvious witticism, the surface, because again, there's depth and layers and things, but the Caesar's Messiah Bert connection, the one that helps make readers understand the surface layer of typology, is that they're all Marys because they all represent, the characters in the Gospels are representing the women in the Messianic movement that rebelled. So they're, by definition, all Marys. They're all rebellious females.
Right. Have you ever seen Moses in the role of a sacrificial animal? That he's kind of used by God for this purpose of extracting the Hebrews from Egypt so that they can become the Israelites, but he's not allowed to enter the country. He's done, and then he is taken up into heaven or whatever.
Why they don't let Moses in, it's kind of it is a mystery. And of course, you have the mirror. There's always these one event links to the other, and to start out with, you have the sacrificial animal, right? The Passover lamb, and then Moses can't. At 40 years later, Moses for some reason can't go in, and then moreover, providing a platform for your concept is the fact that the typologic connections between Jesus and Moses are very, very dense and overt. All right, the characters are being linked, and of course, Jesus is in fact a human sacrifice at the end of the story. So as is there kind of a deeper implication about what's going on in relationship between Moses and God? Is possible.
Right. Okay. Might we compare modern day seminarians with the Sanhedrin in that it's presented as this kind of official governing religion, which kind of defeats the purpose of true religion?
My take is that Christianity is is a annex of the imperial cult, and it's created for, it has been used for social control. So yeah, I would certainly say that's a good, it is a a false Sanhedrin. It's creating a legal structure basically for your slavery. And then this goes to, like our political moment, where they'll say, well, you need to take the vaccine, it's mandated, and the justification is that, we're trying to implement herd immunity. Okay. And there's laws then that are created. Well, the whole thing is absurd, but you when you present it in the context of a religious, in that case of, self-sacrificing of, of your selfishness for the greater good, you're just using a kind of mind control technique, and so when you look at, I'm not sure seminaries, because there you're really training individuals to be the representative of the political power. But I would say the College of Cardinals would be, certainly a better example of that as a really, obviously it's a political organization which represent, certainly in the in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, which represents itself as a religious one, and it does so just because that's just a better camouflage to get people to obey. So in terms of the Sanhedrin, I mean, the one that I think you're really can best compare it to is the Herodian Sanhedrin, because remember the Herods tried to, as the Romans did consistently, take political and kind of intellectual control over Judaism by implementing the high priest as a Roman political appointee, and then the Herodians created their whole Sanhedrin, which could interpret laws, and of course would look at that in a Roman light. I mean, obviously the Herodian Sanhedrin would have seen the Messianic rebels as blasphemous and had some pseudo-religious basis for their condemning them in a religious light. But I would think that studying the seminary in this way is very useful, because my position politically is that at this point, the more skepticism of religious and political structures and organizations, the better. We should start there, and then they have to prove to us that they're legitimate, even if the legitimacy is based in mythology. At least it would, if it's legitimate, you can deal with them in that level. But when it's sophistry, when you're dealing with pseudo characters, who are just claiming to, trying to lead us into a worker's paradise or into a post-mortem paradise or some other excuse for their having political power over us, then you have to break through the facade that they give us, just to get to kind of an even intellectual playing field where you can attack them as trying to enslave us. Whereas I don't think you have that problem with legitimate religious individuals. They may be deluded, I mean, that happens, but I think they would just be an easier class to deal with than the sophists, which is the primary. Well, it is the group we have to deal with at this point in our history.
Okay, now I wanted to touch on Contra Celsus, or Celsus, as people might pronounce that name. that he and other Roman writers believed that Christians are dangerous precisely because they put the advancement of their beliefs above the common good and the welfare of the state.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that when they were trying to implement Christianity, that you would get just all imagined sorts of reaction to it. I've always thought that most of the Christian apologetics are just fictional polemics, where they set up someone who has contradictions of Christianity, and then the wiser, more profound person works through these things and exposes the person who's not thinking clearly. So that would be my take on Contra Celsum. I mean, I know that Origen wrote it supposedly because some wealthy guy wanted a way to respond to Celsus, and so that strikes me as suspicious. But I mean, these things are important. I mean, it's kind of useful to read them just because what's really invaluable about them is that you can see sort of the intellectual struggle that was going on behind the scenes. I mean, remember, this all leads up with Christianity becoming the state religion, but there was a struggle.
It's the state religion in Texas, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. But so the thing is, there was this intellectual struggle that would have taken place between people who would think that the imperial cult and paganism is the way to go politically, as opposed to some group, obviously, that were thinking, nah, we got to go with Christianity. We need monotheism. I think monotheism was attractive to the imperial group because it just created a more narrowly defined kind of criteria for behavior, and whereas paganism, it just was so broad based that it there was creativity possible because the gods would be in contradiction of one another, and this was just not a good ruling platform. I mean, I think this would be my conjecture as to why Christianity actually won out and became the Roman state religion, is they saw the power of the monotheistic control over the subjects as being what they could most easily use to set up a empire-wide slave state. I mean, think about how difficult that is to do. Imagine if you're sitting there like in the 1st century or the 2nd century, and you're like a Roman emperor, and you're going, how can we ossify this? For my family, for
Right.
1,000 years, we have the same structure. Well, you got to get rid of, public education. You got to make all these changes. Well, so you got to get rid of paganism, because you really want monotheistic control. That is the single point of theology. Very narrow catechism training. And you end up with just very narrowly, the mental capacity has just been narrowed and narrowed. I mean, the real thing that was destroyed in the feudal system onset was the intellectual capacity of the European. So it was going to take a long time, and so in that process, and I think before like the 4th century onset of Christianity as state religion, you had stuff like Contra Celsus. I mean, this representing the struggle, the behind the scenes struggle, and my point is this literature is reflective, in my opinion, of that hidden struggle. I mean, this is really what it's representing, is the intellectual struggle that people like Origen would have been going through. I don't see him as obviously as a sincere Christian. I think he's a Roman intellectual who's adopting this role for a political purpose, and he's producing this literature with the idea that it will, show the domination, intellectual domination that the Christian religion has over its critics.
Okay.
And so that's how I look at all of that stuff. I mean, I look at Eusebius in the same way, all of his histories and things. I mean, I think, here's the sad truth. If you look at Caesar's Messiah and you just go through the analysis and you go, yeah, it's really clear, the Roman imperial court came up with this literature, for whatever purposes, vanity and for social control. But it isn't just the historicity of Jesus that is now, we've lost, but we've also lost all of the sort of the acceptance of the sincerity of the authors who we think of as reflecting historical, you know, polemics or history itself. I mean, what we got, Philip, is just a lump of propaganda. I mean, you look at all of the Roman histories, and I think everything that comes forward before the Enlightenment. I mean, it's just propaganda.
Right.
And
They preferred traditions to history is what I see.
yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I'm letting
let's
that on my own.
let's do a whole show on that. I'd love to get your take on it.
All right. Excellent, sir. I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Philip, and I'm looking forward to our next discussion.
Please subscribe to Magic Jesus at youtube.com/@magicjesus.